Planning Commission here tonight?
They are, but they'll establish quorum separately once they take their seats. So then you guys have the luxury of being able to leave if you want to after your recommendation.
I see, okay.
A dual meeting.
Okay.
Austin?
Yeah.
All right, welcome everybody to the rain delayed joint commission meeting between planning and complete streets. Originally dated was March 16th, today March 23rd, so many delays. I'd like to establish a quorum for the CSC. We have 4 members present out of our 7, so we have an established quorum. Tonight we are looking at bicycle parking and providing recommendations and suggestions for the zoning ordinance text amendments. And that is the only item that's being considered tonight.
Can you, please, sorry to interrupt, could you read off which CST people are here? Because she's taking notes.
All right, pardon me.
A lot of people don't know names and things.
Tom Schneider,
Steve Katz.
Steve Katz, Cindy Oye, Suzanne Ambiel. Not present is Nadeem Malouf, Stacy Banerjee, and Suresh. Thank you, Suresh. It's coming to me.
Right.
Thank you. Interrupt me if I skip a step. It's been a few years. Okay, with that, I'd like for the presentation on this item to begin from the city. So I will then hand over to the city for a presentation on the recommendations for changes to the bicycle parking.
All right. So thank you, Complete Streets Commissioners. So I'm Nick Zorn, the Development Services Director. This is going to seem a little bit repetitive for the planning commissioners just because it follows the same structure that we've recently done with some of our implementing housing ordinances that have previously been heard. So just so you have some background and understand why we're here tonight and what the process is of what has led up to this and necessitating the zoning text amendments. So tonight, this is a housing element implementing ordinance for bicycle parking regulations. Just by way of background is on January 24th, earlier this year, the city adopted our 6-cycle housing element. Within the 6-cycle housing element contained various programs, which then further implement essentially all of the established goals, policies of the city as required by law. So to kind of give you a background, which is what essentially is the basis of why we are here this evening, is a program establishes the action that the city is going to take post-adoption of their housing element. Included inside of each program is an overview of what the topic is, specific steps the city will take to implement the program, the time frame, which is actually why we are here and why we needed to make sure that we continued and adjourned the last week's meeting to this week, and funding sources that would inevitably help complete the project. This is something that is just led by city staff, so no additional funding sources were needed for this particular item. And then what is the quantified objective? So this is actually a regurg of exactly what's in our housing element for program 3K, which is the standardization of multimodal transportation requirements. As all of the commissioners of the CSC that are present are aware, is that obviously you've previously reviewed some development applications for housing, specifically obviously where land use is mostly housing or residential related here in the city of Los Altos. So that's pretty much the bread and butter of what the commissions all see, no matter which one you're appointed to. But specifically, this program does require the city to, what's in the red and underlined, is to develop and streamline standards for multimodal housing projects by adoption of development standards, which are being integrated into the zoning code. For things such as bicycle and pedestrian parking, traffic, and public transportation issues. So with that is what's specifically before you tonight, and there will be obviously additional opportunities, and we can always add new or more additional items into our code. Is the specific one, which has obviously been essentially the one thing that the CSC has asked for at almost every time they've reviewed a private development application, is specifics on bicycle parking or bicycle storage, however you want to term it, as well as the associated charging for things such as like e-bikes. So because of housing law, those are standards that really need to be integrated into our local code in order for them to actually be enforceable and not to ever be able to really be subject to challenge. There's always obviously things such as density bonus that could potentially kind of deviate from the required standards that we do integrate into our code, but this helps to further strengthen and memorialize what the city actually desires to continue being able to actually request and enforce as a part of our standard applications for any type of development. So the draft ordinance, this is a pretty short PowerPoint because I'd actually prefer to more so go to a page turn if you have any specific questions, comments, or concerns about the draft ordinance. Is just a high level is that the draft ordinance does standardize and incorporate, for most part, almost verbatim, the VTA bicycle technical guidelines, and standardizes them by integrating them into our zoning code. There are a couple things that I think for best practices have been somewhat modified in order to be able to adapt them to our code for that purpose. That comes by way of what we've seen over the last several years in this jurisdiction as well as in others. But it does help to incorporate short-term bicycle parking standards, which is class 2, long-term, which is class 1, and then bicycle stall and storage space ratios. Because you have not really seen this before, one of the reasons why this is necessitated for us to do this is that there's always the risk of penalties for non-compliance with our housing element. This is a program that is required in our housing element, so we don't have the option to not do something. It's obviously the program doesn't exactly say we need to use VTA's guidance. If you had had another, regional agency that we wanted to adopt, we could adopt that. It's just we've always leaned in on VTA's regional guidance documents for a variety of different things. So that's why that was utilized as the base roadmap for this particular ordinance, because it is important for us to be able to kind of, like we say, do the low-hanging fruit or the things that we know are quick wins in order to further help check off the box. Because in the first year of the implementation of the housing ordinance, the Development Services Department has 26 deliverables, which are almost all zoning amendments or general plan amendments that have to be accomplished. So it's pretty much 2 a month at minimum, if not more, as quickly as we can kind of achieve some of those programs. Again, this is kind of just a regurg, as there has been a lot of legal challenge recently, and for people not implementing their housing elements. So again, that is one of the reasons why staff is bringing this forward to the commission in order to be able to effectively further safe harbor the city from any potential legal recourse. So the next steps is that the city council public hearings are tentatively scheduled for the 11th and the 25th of next month. That is because going back to program 3K is that this does say that the recommendation does need to be received by May of this year. So realistically, this is something that has to kind of have a quick turnaround, as expeditious as we can. So with that, the staff recommendation is obviously the first one for the Complete Streets Commission, which is to provide a recommendation to the Planning Commission regarding the bicycle parking regulations to be incorporated into zoning. And so that is my PowerPoint in regards to what we're here for tonight, and then I'll open it up to the commission for questions. I don't think so. We don't have even anybody logged in, right, from public.
No.
So essentially, we'll probably be able to keep going.
This is a public hearing, so no public comment.
No. I mean, you can ask your questions and we can double check. And then,
I will check this one.
Before we move on to that,
yes, so those are just written in though. So those comments are something that the commission, we did provide those just so that you can reference them for any kind of commission questions or discussion, as well as you can utilize that to somewhat also lead your recommendation tonight, but we don't read them into the record like some jurisdictions do.
So before we move on, I'm going to ask the commissioners if there are any clarifying questions on the presentation or the material that you've reviewed before you. I'll start at the end. Tom, any questions or clarifying? Not comments, but clarifying questions. Keep you to it.
I guess one of the things would be, we're talking about electric bikes. Does this also include things like the electric scooters, e-scooters, or one wheels that also have charging capabilities?
That was not something that was specifically integrated. It's definitely something that if we want to kind of refine and incorporate some specific things for the scooters, we definitely can. One of the things though that I'll at least just piggyback on that is that, you know, a lot of times in developments such as, you know, the multifamily that we're starting to see more and more of where this is applicable, because obviously this doesn't apply to single family homes. You know, a lot of folks end up taking the smaller types of, you know, personal, you know, I guess, what do you call that? I mean, beyond just a scooter. Yeah, there you go. A lot of times they do take them just because, you know, some people are creative at not necessarily getting the entire device, but parts of it, unfortunately. And, you know, you come back and, oh, well, the top part's gone now. And I mean, I live in a multifamily, so I've seen it firsthand. So, but we can work on that further to bring it back. It's just separate as a part of this. Yeah. Yeah.
Some of those guys do have charging, like the one wheel or the hoverboards.
Yeah. Yep. And I mean, obviously someone could obviously just hook up to it. It's just that these ones are specifically designed for the bicycle storage component.
Yeah.
Just a clarifying question, which is that if as a commission, through the discussion, we wanted to amend one or more of these specific recommendations, what would the next step be then in terms of follow-up? Or would there be another meeting then, or would we make that decision tonight and then have an amended document that would go forward to the council?
So it could be either way, that you make your recommendation and that staff can then incorporate that, and then that ultimately gets to the city council after the planning commission makes their recommendation, or staff can potentially bring it back. I would request is that if we can get just very clear defining direction, that we get that tonight so that we can incorporate it, because we are on, and it's not, so the one thing I do want to, just because we haven't talked, at least myself directly with the CSC, is that, like I said, I have, you know, for this agency and our city as a whole, 26 deliverables. So this is a low hanging fruit. Me having to come back with it is kind of just adding to the timeline for everything else. And so we really need to get firm direction, because technically the Complete Streets Commission only has a maximum of one more meeting to be able to consider this item.
Then I have one other. Yep. Is that in looking at the comments, a couple of the specific recommendations on here are very close to what the VTA has specified, but there's just some small discrepancies. As we go through this, will we get some feedback as to whether that was simply an oversight or whether there was a reason for that?
We can definitely clarify to illuminate that. And then also too, just to somewhat preface the Complete Street, is if there's even a recommendation that you all agree to, that you want to just have incorporated as a part of the recommendation, we can just do that by virtue of identifying it in the record. I'll highlight it and we'll integrate it and put it into the final draft that would go to the city council to continue the item moving forward.
Thank you.
I was going to ask about if it would be great if we can highlight some of the exceptions or adjustments that we made here as it differs from the VTA guideline. And then also just one question around what year are the current VTA guidelines from, just so we can understand.
I'd have to pull the ones up. It's the ones directly posted to their, at least what this was based upon was the most recent up-to-date ones.
The current VTA
bike parking guidelines were updated last year in 2021. And Lola came to the CSD from BTA and presented the updates to us. I forget what mid-year.
I have no clarifying questions, so now is an opportunity for public comment. So again, I don't have any comment cards in front of me, and I don't know who's out in the ether. So set up a flare. Do you have any questions? Do you want to comment on this?
There is no one online. Pushing the comment.
Okay, great.
We don't. We're not here.
Okay, all right. Perfect. I just want to make sure everybody has that chance.
Stacy had a lot of comments.
That's a commissioner, so
I know.
it's
It's
public.
one of those emails.
I know.
Okay.
I got it. Got it right here. All right, so now we're going to go back to the commission and have a commission discussion on the matter. And Tom, since you so gracefully provided a segue, we'll start with you. Discussion on the matter.
So far, I think everything sounds good. I like all the comments. Everybody has thought a lot of this through, I think. Kind of getting what he was saying, maybe some differences between what the BT guidelines say, but what we're proposing is, so that's called out by Stacy's email.
Perhaps the city could comment on the discrepancies between the VTA guidelines and what's written here. Was some of it done with intent, or was it an oversight, or was there a choice made that no, we don't want to do 75, we want to do 72 instead? Can you elaborate a little bit more on some of those differences?
So I think the 72, I mean, staff's totally fine with saying 75. There wasn't anything that I think was probably just a typing issue, essentially. So, I mean, we're fine with that. There's no argument there from us. B2A, the well-lit area. So obviously there's a certain level of, and I think VTA did a great job in that. It's a very comprehensive document. And then some, so like B2A, like to say, like the guidelines mention a well-lit area. Well, if you actually look at B2A, it actually references that it's in an enclosed area. If we're talking about multifamily, I mean, even parking garages, they have lights throughout them. So I mean, that's just getting really prescriptive. And unfortunately, we're not always going to get, kind of what we saw at 330 Dissel, which is something right off the main vestibule that has, right off the main street. That's not going to always happen, although that would maybe be the preferred design method. There has to be a little bit of flexibility with where they're going to inevitably place, a pretty good amount of square footage for bicycle storage. And really the well-lit thing, I mean, I think we can definitely include language like that. I think it's kind of going to just happen already because garages always have lights in multifamily when they are actual parking garages. And obviously if it's indoors, it's going to have lighting. So that's fine if the commission wants to make that as a part of their recommendation. Staff has no objection to that. Some of it is, I would say, A7 in reference to schools. That's a little bit more operational. I would also look to if we need further discussion about that from the city attorney to opine on. The city doesn't really have purview over exactly what the schools do on their property. Or safe routes to school is a different story, though. That's in our public realm. But actually, to put specific requirements, we could, but it's not necessarily anything. It's kind of like just the stuff that we've talked about before. It's nice and fluffy and cush. It looks nice, but it's not really enforceable. There's a separate reviewing authority for anything that's considered a public school. So that's just transparency right there. The quad outlet, I mean, again, we could include something like that. I mean, I think that's just kind of somewhat just a little bit of, well, what does exactly a quad outlet mean? For some developers are going to ask that, exactly. So we would probably further define that to clarify exactly what that means and looks like for them. There's obviously different ways for them to achieve the same outcome of a quad outlet versus not. So there's that. C1, so I know that it looks like the chair had mentioned is that the VTA goals at the top end for most requirements is something that we actually did propose. However, multifamily residential city staff has the VTA minimum of 1 per unit for long-term parking, not the VTA goal of 1 per bedroom. I think the commission really needs to kind of hold on to that, is that it's a goal, it's not their minimum, it's not their requirement. It's a good thing, but that's a lot to ask of some developers when we're not necessarily as bicycle friendly as some other jurisdictions. Like if you're in San Francisco, obviously that makes a lot more sense because almost everyone has that.
Comment. We have or had a condo in downtown Los Altos that had underground parking. And there were secure bike rack. There was a secure bike rack that had 1 spot for every unit. And I would say maybe 15% of the units had children. And as a result of that, people were always jockeying to get their bike into one of those spaces, and there are always more bikes than there were units. Now, I think 1 per bedroom may be aggressive, but 1 per unit feels to me like it's not quite enough. So I don't know if there's a way to bridge that gap and maybe compromise a little bit and have more than 1 per unit, especially in multifamily projects where you expect to have some family occupancy.
So the one thing that I'll is just throw out there, just to keep it fresh in your mind with your comment, is that you can always do a half ratio as a part of it. You could do 1.5. So that renders another 50% of the quantified number. For example, I technically have that as well for bike storage in my garage. However, I'm a little phobic about it because I've seen what people have done and taken this part of whatever bike it is. And so I bring mine into my unit, and I live alone, so I have that ability. I don't have to, have that space. So I think there's obviously that. So I don't necessarily think the solution is to say, well, let's do 2 a unit then to at least guarantee multiple. I think there's that happy median, which I think is maybe something the commission might be open to. So just something to keep in mind with that. Some suggestions about included in spaces for oversized bikes. It's just something that I don't think we've really seen that much of an issue with yet. And again, this is the first time that we're going to have something integrated into our standards. So I think that's why staff, we kind of just felt that it wasn't maybe necessary to integrate it in the first round, and then we can kind of see. Again, one of the things that I kind of iterated to community members, commissioners, specifically obviously planning, and previous and current council members, is zoning codes are not meant to be the stone tablet that was etched in and that it does never changes. It's meant to grow. It's meant to change with the community. For all intents and purposes, it's meant to change and be the implementation of our general plan. Communities change over time. So if in a year from now, when we're maybe doing another component of something multimodal related and integrating that into our code, we can then maybe expand and add certain other provisions that we've noticed. And so that's obviously something. So I think that's one of the reasons why that particular bullet wasn't necessarily included. The one thing that I will say about bus stop guidelines, I'm very apprehensive to do that because it's kind of giving false promises to developers. We do not have the final say in bus stops at all. And VTA very well could have to amend their bus stop regulations because of any type of issue that may happen in their infrastructure. And if they were to change that, then our code is just going to be ineffective and out of compliance. So realistically, it wasn't necessarily that we don't obviously support, right? We want them to be the newer ones that are coming online. But anytime you do a development that is within the realm of VTA and there's a bus stop, it has to go through them, and VTA does tell them you have to do our standards. So this bullet is actually already in effect. It's just based on the fact that they're the regional provider.
I have a couple of questions and comments. Regarding the electrical outlets, I think it's important that we provide as specific as we can get, technical recommendations. Otherwise, we are at risk of having a standard outlet, and that's not sufficient to charge 2 or 3 bikes. So I think to the extent it's possible, we should find specific specs for 2 or 3 different types of e-bikes that are out there today that are common. And I can give you a list of common e-bikes. I follow that market pretty closely. And I think that if we can do that and then promise ourselves, we will go back and look at that in a year because the technology is changing this fast. So if we can, and if we're permitted to that, we have to be a little more specific than an electrical outlet. And when we brought this up to developers, they're like, oh yeah, that would be cool. Yeah, that's a selling point. So we haven't gotten a whole lot of pushback when we ask for that. A second thing with that, with the e-bike parking, you have to be able to lock your bike while it's charging. So it has to be a location that you can lug the thing, lock the thing, charge the thing. It'd be even more wonderful if it told you when it was done so you can move it. I'm stretching. I'm asking for the world here, so I'm not going to ask for that. But we can't even get people to move Teslas after they're done charging. So why would they move a bike? So I think we need to be a little more specific there because you're only going to see more e-bikes. With regards to the oversized bikes, I know it's not a problem yet. And it won't be a problem if we don't anticipate it. One way families can get around having multiple bikes is they have a bike that can carry 3 kids. The bucket bike, sometimes called a buck feet. With the kids in the ground and the groceries in the front, and off you go. And it's also an e-bike. So there are many versions of that out there, and more families are using those to commute. I've seen 3 in Los Altos already, and when I go to the farmer's market, I see more than 3 there. So if we can think about those oversized units and have maybe accommodations for 1 oversized bike in that locker area, I think that would be wise and visionary of us, I'll say.
Does that include the 3-wheeled bikes?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah, 3-wheeled bikes and bikes with buckets in the front or extra long bikes. They're U-bikes or a tandem. Yeah, so long and wide, right? So give more gracious space to it. With regards to being well lit, yes, parking garages are well lit. However, it's been my experience when developers are asked to put in long-term parking and storage for bikes, they use the deepest, darkest, ugliest place like that parking garage and don't light it. So we have to push back and say, no, it's got to be easily accessible by the bicyclists. They got to be able to come down that elevator and get to it without staking their way and then going into the darkest part of the parking garage. So I know it sounds a little too picky, Annie, but you know what? Put a light in it, right? If they're going to pull power for the e-bikes, pull power for a light that goes on when you walk in. I think that's important. Going to the depth, 75 inches, yes, please. A standard bike is about 6 feet, which is 72 inches. A little bit shorter, depending on how wide your bike is, the geometry of it, but only having 2 inches on either side to maneuver, it's a tight space. So even giving a few more inches makes a big difference when you're trying to wrangle your bike into a parking. And then when that parking is implemented, it's important that they put those racks far enough away from the wall so that the bike frame can actually line up to the stand. If you go to Safeway downtown and you try and park your bike there, you can't use their parking, their bike racks that are covered because they put them too close to the wall. And so your bike ends up with your front wheel lining up to the rack. If you just lock your front wheel, at the end of the day, what will you have? A front wheel. That's it. So it's important that we make sure the developers put the rack that you're going to lock to in the correct location. And I know I'm getting really picky on this, but I'm not going to apologize. You know, the width is tight as well, down there, but I understand it's probably all we can do. That's what VTA recommended. I do agree with you. The schools and the bus stops are outside of our remit. This is not, about parking. This is about parking for multifamily dwellings. This is not about school parking, which is state property. We really can't, we can ask, we can plead, we can smile, but we can't.
No, they usually exempt themselves from our zoning.
Yeah, exactly, because it's state. So all we can do is smile and say, please, but they can do whatever they choose to do. And same with bus stop. I don't think that's should be pulled into this. With regards to other types of conveyance devices, whether that's a scooter or a one-up or the wheel, I don't think that we can provide guidelines for those things because this is for bicycle parking. When you look at the vehicle code, those other types of conveyance devices are considered pedestrians and bicycles are considered vehicles. So this is about storing vehicles, not other conveyances. Oh, they do. Absolutely they do. And they scare me to death at night. So I don't think we can get very specific on that. I think we have to remain a little bit mute on the matter of those other conveyance devices.
I agree. I also think that that scooters and segways and things like that are physically smaller and can be stored in other places.
Yeah.
And typically are either in a secure locker area or in the unit itself.
The VTA table C1, where it's one per unit, pick the best for last. My concern here is twofold. One is I'm seeing more and more developments come in with BMR units, allowing them, in lieu and under park the facility so that they have one parking spot per unit for vehicles. And then they allocate one bike per unit. Now all of a sudden you have 2-bedroom and 3-bedroom units. The likelihood of that unit being occupied by a family unit with 2 cars and multiple bikes, but they only get 1 and 1. The question the city, I think, has to ask is when these developments go in, what happens then? Where does the excess go? For bikes, what we would always do on CSC is ask the developer, are your hallways wide enough for people to haul their bikes up and down? Are the balconies big enough to store the bikes? Because that's where they will end up. Or will you have CCA's covenants that says you can't park bikes on your balcony? So that always catches their attention because that's what will happen to the bikes. If you don't have enough storage for them and you have a family with 2 kids and mom and dad, and we want them to ride their bikes to school, not going to happen. So I think there's a problem growing and we're not exactly addressing it. And I know difficult where we're at with state guidelines and what we can and cannot do. If we can up that ratio to 1.5, I think that will help. It will not solve, but it will give a little more grace than 1-to-1. So I'm concerned. Mom and dad will have a bike. Kids will have a bike. There's 2 kids, you're going to have 4 bikes. If you're like me, forget about it. I've got 15.
Yeah, so one thing and again, I'm obviously the one that threw out the 1.5. I'm just going to throw this in because it just pops in my head. It's because I know the CSC hasn't really seen as many, obviously, as I see in my profession of development applications that use what you're referencing as density bonus.
Right.
And this has been a very big conversation that we've talked about in every jurisdiction that I've been a part of in California in the last 6 years. And actually, density bonus, ironically, has been almost double and triple down almost every year with the legislature. So when jurisdictions try to do anything that kind of seems like, okay, well, we're going to do that so that we have it as a requirement, to some degree, it almost sparks like the developers, okay, well, then I'm going to request an entire waiver concession to deviate from this. And you're not going to get anything from it because they're going to be able to do that and there's nothing we can do. So when you do it, when you go too aggressive to try and remedy the problem, you actually then peel the layer back where it actually leaves you with nothing. And there is actually nothing we can do.
Right.
So that's my only thing that I would caution any commission from doing with anything with parking or any type of development standard. When you try to do too much to correct right now, if it's a housing project, they're protected by density bonus, the Housing Accountability Act, a lot of different things. So anything beyond the 1.5 is, I can just pretty much tell you, you probably should expect that they're gonna get a waiver or concession for it, which will deviate from whatever your recommendation is.
So are you suggesting that 1.5 would be a good number to use?
I would say that's probably the absolute maximum you might be able to get away with. I think 1 is probably super digestible from a developer's mind. You might get some of them. I mean, I'll be honest, when I was a planner in Encinitas, I had one developer, super cool guy, literally wrote into our meetings every single week and he had plans hanging out of his backpack on a bike, you know, but in a suit. And I'm like, all right, you're cool. You're a California dude. And it was for him, but that wasn't for everybody. But he would be probably the proponent, like, oh yeah, let's do three a unit, but not every developer is going to be like that because the numbers are a little challenging to pencil out right now, especially with construction costs. Unfortunately, they keep on going up.
Well, I think we should ask for 1.5 because I think we're going to, even with 1.5, we're going to find ourselves in a world of hurt in about 6 years, where we're going to see a lot of spillage into the neighborhoods, and residents won't be happy with high density units, 1 in the neighborhood, 2 with the extra cars parking on their street. And there will be extra cars because there won't be room for bikes. And if we're trying to encourage bike transit in town, we have to go the extra yard and have proper bike storage and bike parking. So not something we can address in a zoning ordinance or things of this nature, but I think writ large, the city has to step back and think about what are we going to do when these high density developments go up? Is there something that the city can do to augment and support these developments in a different way that is city owned and city run and not imposed upon the developer? Can we put up bike storage sheds nearby where people could store bikes? Can we bike garages, things of that nature that we can then control? So it's just something for us to think about in the future. How can we be a little more creative and not expect the developer to do it all? So those are my thoughts. So I know you need a recommendation from us to you about what to do next. Do I have any other comments before we go there?
All that were said on, that gets written into the municipal code for the city. Is it enforceable by building permits and by the building inspectors of the city?
By entitlements, and also then it would, when it goes through building plan check, for something like this, the planners would be further plan checking it in building plan check. So
It can be enforced by the inspectors when they go and inspect the projects, or
yeah, so whatever is the yield of parking so just even if we just look at it for the base of what we have right now, for parking stalls, actual vehicles, planners, when they go out in the field before the final sign off on everything, and that you do need a planning final in order to actually get what all developers really need is a certificate of occupancy, especially if they're for sale units and it's not just a one-off unit. They need it, especially for their financing, because otherwise it doesn't close. So for that, I mean, it all hinges on us being able to go there and actually do the base layer of what is actually required for the ratio count. So, you know, if we were to do a 1.5 ratio and that ends up yielding, you know, 92 stalls, obviously that's going to be higher than, you know, just saying, oh yeah, there's one for every unit. So we're going to have to figure out how many there is. So they do double check that. I mean, yes, in some cases we do have building inspectors, and this is just information sharing for the commission. We do have them check certain things when they're out in the field, but that's because it's somewhat tied to really more of like a actual physical construction that requires them to look at it before it's closed up or, you know, not accessible any longer.
I have another question related to the multifamily. Do you know, are there examples of other similar cities or other cities that have a lot of development going up that use a different number for theirs? Have you seen that be successful?
Like Mountain View, for instance.
Yeah.
What did Mountain View use?
So if you guys don't understand, Stephanie used to be the zoning administrator in Mountain View. So she pretty much approved everything for the last several years in the town. So what was it? One per unit. So. Did you often have people try to deviate from it? No. So again, that's also partly where I was trying to at least just inform the commission is like, what's the sweet spot where you don't want to try to overcorrect at the beginning. And again, it's iterative. We can start adding more in future years. Again, it's just, I have to give you guys the devil's advocate situation. But then I also have to then also say the community has to then understand why we can't actually get anything sometimes. The bicycle parking thing I do think is somewhat where they'll say, okay, well, we'll go to the one per unit. But that's only if they're a seasoned developer and know that that's what most other jurisdictions are doing. If they don't, they're going to say course correction and, oh no, I only want to do 50% of what the threshold would have been if we left it at what the VTA minimum standard is.
But I think developers today are savvy enough looking around at bicycles and what people are doing on bicycles, that for them to completely eliminate bike parking out of, spite for being asked to do too much, I think that would be a detriment to their overall development. People would find that a failing and wouldn't want to be there. That's my presumption.
No, and I agree with you. It's just, to give you all of the devil's advocate components, it's just that, yeah, it's just the one thing you have to be cognizant of when making the decision.
I appreciate that.
Any other discussion from commissioners? Right, do we have a motion from someone to move the recommendation forward? Anybody want to make a motion? Do you want me to make the motion?
Suzanne.
Okay, I move that we recommend presenting the new bicycle parking ordinance to council, subject to the changes we discussed tonight and agreed to by
Developer director, Nick Lawrence.
Nick, our friend Nick here, based on the comments received by various members of the commission and the public.
And I think quickly, because I have them jotted down just so that to have the affirmative is that we will be putting specifications in regards to the outlets. I'm going to include it. I'm going to be straightforward. It's going to be based on voltage, which is actually what it needs to be because that's duplicative of what's in the building code. So always make it easier for developers. We will then increase it to the VTA to the 75 inches. We will include the standard language of just saying well lit for the storage of bicycle for long term. We will increase it to 1.5 per unit as discussed. And then we will, I'm actually gonna look a little bit further into the suggestion for oversized and create a percentage ratio that then increases it so that there is some oversized as a part of it.
So subject to the changes articulated by Nick, we move the new bike parking regulations ordinance to council. Do I have a second?
Okay, I have a second from Mr. Schneider.
All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed? 3 absent. Did you get what you wanted?
I did, yes, thank you very much.
And more, I know. I hope
Okay.
someone warned you that we're persnickety.
There you go.
We're detail oriented, right, Marissa?
We made our job very easy.
Yeah, you did. Thank you. Is there any other items of business for the CSC members?
No, the CSC can adjourn themselves and then the planning commission will take.
Okay, the CSC is adjourned. Thank you all for coming tonight on such short notice. Don't get blown home. Watch out for branches.
Yeah, and then you have your regularly scheduled meeting next week. Okay, yep.
Thank you.
Great.
Good to see you all in person for the first time.
Yeah. Nothing, they're just gonna affirmative it because it's going into, yeah. I mean, if they have any action or anything to discuss about it that they think, then that's it.
meeting in person.
Yeah, once they, you need, one more, yep, I'll grab it. Right here, yeah, thank you.
I know, it's okay.
Next to you.
Yeah.
Sure.
And you're Stephanie, right? Hi, I'm Susan. So I'm quite interviewing.
Burn.
By the council meeting when.
Yeah, same reason as our the power outage. Yeah, we were left from Tuesday afternoon until Friday morning with no power.
Okay, so do we have to technically take a vote, a roll call for the quorum because we're the planning commission?
Yep,
Okay,
and then,
yeah.
and we'll see what we're out.
I thought we did as opposed to them just doing it during like.
2 meetings technically. Kind of. Yeah. It's easier than having one large table and kind of having infighting.
Okay, so are we ready to? Are we waiting for?
We should wait if we want a second.
Okay, okay. Can I just talk?
Yeah.
It seems to me a lot of what we would be discussing was discussed in the prior meeting. We're having kind of a great week and.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank goodness for the lady with all the questions.
Okay.
Thank goodness for the lady with all the
Yeah,
questions.
I mean,
Stuff it.
and I think.
I loved that Mountain Dew was clarified at 1 because that really can make a project. Well, first of all, the developer can just say, I'm not gonna do it. Yeah, so that was great that you clarified that at 1, because sometimes we get a little too egregious.
And I think we can just assume the 4 changes, the 5 changes you outlined are what we're gonna be discussing. If we have any further questions on that, okay. So
Yeah, or unless you saw something that is.
And we can
that's
add other
in-
things.
Yeah, or that's in the draft that you're like, well, that's a little nutty, yes, then we
Okay.
can talk about that as well.
But I should wait to ask you a question then.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and because we'll take a quick roll really quick and then we can,
Okay, I think we're ready to roll.
Yeah.
First in, first in meeting. Okay, Stephanie, could you take a roll call so we can establish
yeah.
quorum?
Yes, so, Great.
Okay,
well done.
well done, so we're done on that.
If you can count to 7, we must all be here.
Okay, are there any public comments for items not on the agenda? I have no way of knowing, so, okay, we'll go with that.
No, there's no one online.
Okay. Let me know if there is at any point. We're just gonna roll through it. Okay, we need to approve the minutes from our last meeting. Does anyone want to make that motion?
I'll move it. Whatever it was.
Do we have- It's from February 16th.
February 16th.
Do we have a second? Okay, let's take a vote on that. I think Stephanie, you need to call us.
Commissioner Disney,
Aye.
Commissioner Benato,
Yes.
Commissioner Durant. Yeah. Commissioner Roach,
Yes.
Commissioner Steinle.
Yep.
Vice Chair, Aki,
Yes.
Mayor Nancy.
Yes. Okay, we're now going to open the public.
She did something. Cecile Mara, the motion was made by
Thank you.
Steinle and then seconded by Roche. Okay. Yeah, well, we'll have to go back, but then they just all then did the all in favor.
Okay, now let's commence our public hearing on bicycle parking regulations. I believe we've already heard the presentation.
Yes.
So I think, well, we could, if you guys want to.
You can stand here.
So I think the first thing we will do is ask for any commissioner questions, not comments, but questions. Are there any questions? And jump right in.
I have some questions. I apologize in advance for the number of questions. This whole VTA document was based upon a bicycle commute rate. And yeah, it said all the recommendations were because of less than 2%. Does anybody know what ours is by chance? Or should we just assume we're like everybody else?
City staff doesn't have any additional data that supports it. So that's the assumption that would be made, yes.
Okay. And then I had just a question about, and I think somebody asked it from the Complete Streets, which was around, for most of these, you know, one space per 30 beds, one space per this, we followed the, you know, the stretch goal, you know, I think they called it the goal versus the minimums. But for others, you know, we decided not to. So philosophically, was there a reason why in some cases we didn't go for the goal, we went for the minimum? Like, for example, government was lower than the goals in those cases. Is that just gut call? Like Nick, you went through this and like, oh, that sounds good. You know, like how did we change some of those? Any ideas?
So if you want the frank answer is 3 people that work for the city live remotely close. So it's infeasible to really then say for our own government institutional buildings that we would require a high rate of parking for things like that. So we obviously provide some, but also around the civic center specifically. I mean, I've been here almost a year now, actually, and there's really almost never any bikes parked around the civic main buildings to this. The community center is a different story. Technically, also, we have the ability to exempt ourselves from something such as these requirements. So there's that component. So it's really just more of a realistic kind of capacity of what we, you know, can really foresee as having. Did you see any other ones that you were specific to other than the government one?
Well, for government, I was thinking about the library and the community center are very different than City Hall, right? And so having enough spaces for places that are highly trafficked is very different than something that's less highly trafficked. So that was one. I mean, there were a few others. Maybe, I mean, do you want me to bring that up in questions, or do you want me to bring that up in comments?
I mean, this component, I think, of the meeting is a little bit more organic, just because we know we don't have any public comments. So I think either or are going to kind of bleed into each other. So,
so that government and institutional was one. It felt like, you know, the library should have more than one bike parking out front, right? Which I think it does actually. So I don't know if it's a big deal. Multifamily, I actually thought the recommendation from the VTA for the goal of 1 per bedroom was appropriate for, you know, family of 4 living in a 2-bedroom with 4 bikes. But I understood your comments around the 1.5, and it sounds like that's a reasonable compromise. Schools, it sounds like we can ask for something, but it doesn't really matter. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
So I think.
They exempt themselves.
Okay,
I mean, we do have private schools.
right. So
Would apply to private.
so that it felt like you know, we were on the low side there. We were doing more the minimum as opposed to the goal for those. Like we went with 1 per 8. So I thought raising that might be interesting, but the big one for me was around the electric stuff. And I know we talked about it. It's come up in other previous developments where I can't remember if it was planning commission or council who suggested there be like more outlets, because electric bikes are here. They're growing. It's the biggest category in bicycles. Putting in an outlet today is way cheaper than putting in an outlet in the future. So I was going to suggest something crazy, which was 1 per space. Every bicycle space has a electric outlet, and you know, like I'm sure we've seen these strips that have 10 outlets in them. They just run on the wall. It costs $50. Like it's close enough to zero that it seems like an interesting thing. It doesn't get into, I don't know the temporary chair's name from the Complete Streets. It doesn't quite go to the 240 level. That requires more foresight. And since I don't own an electric bike, I don't know what if those are 110s or 120s or 240s. Does anybody know?
Our electric bikes, we can't plug both in the same outlet, they spark out.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so yeah.
So, which is why you want to wire it
Yeah,
in advance.
You need to have your dedicated.
So I will just jump in just so that I don't forget is so there's coming from me, I usually don't play in the gray. But realistically, the ability to be able to, if you're looking to do something like that, I think would be more ripe for the reach codes. It's a little bit more safe and protected versus in your face during entitlements, during density bonus, when they can request a waiver to undo everything you're referencing.
Okay.
I would, because the Complete Streets Commission didn't really kind of request an increase to that, I would say that realistically, that's something that we could look to and that would be built into the building code. So again, it's kind of a little bit more under the radar versus
Okay.
entitlements and zoning.
That sounds fair. It came up in a previous meeting and I'm pretty sure that was the recommendation. It was approved. I don't know if anyone remembers that meeting.
Yeah, I
Didn't-
remember them talking about wiring, but not actually doing, it was for cars, having it wire ready.
Yeah.
Wired ready, but not the actual
It
infrastructure.
might have been Distel Circle, and I remember Pete Daly made a comment about it because he had an electric bike. I don't know if he was a council member at that point or was a member of the public, but so I could be remembering it correctly. And the last thing was just a typo. Jolie, I thought you might want to look at B2A. Long-term parking shall be a fully enclosed or located indoors. I think the A just needs to be removed, possibly. It's in the ordinance, sorry, B2A. And then I'll be quiet.
I have some of those too.
Get out, no?
I have to be there for that one. You see it?
Yeah.
Okay, not a big deal. That's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anybody like to go next?
I'll go next.
Okay.
My favorite is comments, no comments tonight. On the, since we're referring specifically under, on page. Okay, under the, page 2 of the report, we're under discussion and analysis and we're talking about the different kinds of multifamily housing development project of 4 or more units. And it struck me that comes very close to the density bonus 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to infinity thing. Is there any reason we couldn't change that to 5 instead of 4? Because you get a lot of different things happening and it's within one of something. And it might be less confusing if we had the same cutoff point for as much as possible. And that struck me as something that,
Where is it, 4 or more employees?
4 or more
No.
units.
Bullet point number 1.
Oh, 4 more.
For me, and if it said 5 or more, then it would be consistent with a division that happens within the density bonus law. And I think also under the way things are going to be working out, aren't you going to be mostly doing the 0 to 4s and the 5 and ups come to us? So it might be easier all the way around if we had the same numbers for these kinds of things. I'm just that struck me as something that might be worth considering. Unless it's
Is that tied to the MAP Act, like 0, 1 to 4 units, parcel map or 10, or does it need a map and then 4 or more lots needs a 10
Do you
map?
remember? Like the number on the bullet point? Yeah, is it no? I mean,
Tied to something.
yeah, it's tied to something and I can't remember. You're right about density bonus. That's a 5 or more situation. My authority is going to be up to 5. So I mean, I would say that could be like a motion light, where I can verify that if it's consistent with what we can do, we'll change it to 5.
Yeah.
If not, we would then,
It would have to be.
we would remain at 4.
Yeah. Yeah, it just struck me as something that, you know.
In the ordinance? Sorry, is it in the ordinance?
Well, I don't know where it's stemming from though, to be honest, and it could be from something from VTA's guidance. So it's throwing me off a little bit, to be honest.
Yes, I saw it in the discussion analysis. I didn't see anything in the ordinance around.
But you have to have some number, right? And it does seem to me that
Great point.
the more you have the same number, the easier it is for everybody. Particularly since these are all developments that are going to be subject to the density bonus law. Right, and which is going to get me to some other point. The other thing that I had a question about is, again, with sort of in the ordinance itself. I don't understand necessarily. I mean, this is, I'm thinking, under 2, is it 2G, where it talks about the charging for the electric bikes? Okay, if electric bikes are for everybody, it shouldn't, this is just a sort of a punctuation thing. Couldn't that just be a separate, you know, a number 3 rather than G under, you know, because these things are not necessarily going to be inside the storage areas. They're going to be perhaps adjacent to or available to guests or whatever, you know. I mean, this is just a thought that if you have 1, 2, 3, and the electric bike thing could be number 3 because anybody could have an electric bike.
But these are fully enclosed or indoors. This is long.
Yeah, I know.
Right,
Because I know
it's
it's
long,
class
yeah.
1. I'm wondering whether it's exclusively for the class 1 or if it's something that you know, you just make, you talk about it wherever it happens to be, and where it happens to be would be up to whoever's doing it. I mean, I throw that out just as a thought. I am completely indifferent to bicycles and to electric bicycles, so I couldn't care less. But, okay,
I would want it in the locked room if I had.
well, you could have it in the locked room, but I mean, the question is, you know, I mean, it just seemed to me that as a category, it was slightly different from all the locked room stuff. But
Yeah.
maybe that's just me.
That it's just consistent with what VTA's guidance is,
Yeah.
and that's where that stemmed from. Just to also orient the commission is the program 3K specifically calls out that we would utilize specific previous recommendations of the CSC as the basis for this recommendation. The CSC has always previously applied the VTA guidelines.
Okay, yeah, that makes it easier. Yeah, okay, it just struck me as something that, you know, potentially could be. I mean, again, where they are, it doesn't really matter, but, if they're not just in the locked areas, then that would be a separate requirement. So, anyway, and it could be a separate requirement anyway, somebody wants to put a name, you say, this is what it's gotta be. Right. So, okay. Those were the questions I had.
Any other questions from anyone?
I have some questions. Okay, so these are minimums. And I think what you're saying is if you up these minimums, then a developer who's doing affordable units can say, I want development incentives or a waiver to these standards. And so I'm kind of having a hard time understanding this logic. Like if you just put in place what you think is right, it's like you're overshooting and you end up with nothing. I mean, I think that's what you're saying, but if they ask for a waiver, it's not a wholesale waiver of the whole thing. It could be, well, you know, you asked for 3 spots per unit and we think that's too much, so we're not going to do anything. Wouldn't it be more like, well, you know what, we're doing these affordable units, we want a waiver, we think this 3 per unit is too much, so we'll do 1.5. So I'm having a hard time seeing that if you do, you know, if you put in the right number that you think is appropriate, what makes us think that the whole thing gets thrown out when they want a development incentive?
Well, are you gonna answer that? But if you ask for a waiver of the development standard, it is a waiver of that development standard.
Why can't they, I mean, well, then you say, well, so what are their rights? I mean, in terms of that waiver, can the city come back and say, oh, no, we're not going to give you a complete waiver. We'll relax the regulation.
No, Nick, you can chime in, but under density bonus law, and you provide the number of units, for the density bonus, you can get incentives, which are tied into financial. You need that, you need it because the project won't be financial to build the affordable units. A waiver, it's unlimited waivers, and you have to show that the waiver is necessary so you can to construct the affordable units. So if you're taking up too much space in the garage or on the side yard and it's going to interfere with the actual construction of the units, you can ask for waivers and you shall get it.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, the issue with waivers is it would be up to us. The burden of proof is on the city to say you don't need that to be economically viable, and that's a huge burden.
Yeah, one of the biggest things is even with any type of incentive, concession, or waiver, all three of them are fairly interchangeable with which one you could deploy. One has a little bit different of strings attached to the other one. The Banker Hill case, which was out of San Diego, really was affirmed that the burden of proof is carried across all three different types of requests. And it really makes it very challenging for us to come back and say, essentially any type of like redesign or, yeah, you say you want to do 0 and our regular requirement is 3. Well, no, we think you can at least do 1. It's really hard to win that argument anymore after that case because it's considered some type of either an amenity or a feature or a standard. And those three things it's very challenging with the application.
And they will often produce a letter from a consultant who says we cannot build
Yeah,
this.
and so waivers have to go to the construction of the affordable units and incentives are to the financial.
Yeah, the waiver component creates a physical preclusion from the construction, and the other has the tie to the financial feasibility of the project.
And so that's applicable when you heard the Complete Streets talk about, well, geez, we'd like to see more than 1 parking stall per unit, where's everyone gonna park? It's the same thing. If you try and demand more than 1 or try and demand off-street parking, they're not gonna, they can say, we're a hardship, we can't build it. The same with bike parking. And at the 1.5, you know, they're taking up valuable parking for those people who only get 1 space. And if you do 1.5 and then you want these strips for the electric plugs, they're just gonna say, no, you know, you may demand that you spend all your time, but we can't do it physically. You know, if we have 300 units and we only have to have, 100 parking spots, we're not gonna make all this work. So we are pretty well hamstrung by all these things, and by us wanting to have more.
Well, we could do this kind of slow and see how this goes. You can up it. And then if it, if it's, yeah, if it looks like, oh, this is, too high and it's too easy to get a waiver, then, okay, then we come right back here and we adjust it down. I mean, we're in new territory, I think, with this whole affordable housing stuff. So I think we have to give it our best shot and see where it goes.
Although we don't want the governor coming back and us, like, San Francisco and say, you guys are taking way too much time. You're asking for silly things. I'm telling you, you have to build it. I think we have to be reasonable.
But it's below the goal outlined by the VTA. So the goal is 1 per bedroom. So,
Right.
The minimum is 1 per unit. Which could they ask for a waiver on 1 per unit also?
Yeah, they can.
So, so I mean, it's not really. You don't get anything. Right. It would not be
So one of the things though that I want to kind of try and reorient the commission to is that the housing element also does have a separate program which does require the city to do a comprehensive overhaul of our parking ordinance, the actual parking requirements. In general, when you decrease actual automobile parking, you can create a nexus to increase multimodal requirements like parking.
Sure.
This is not right for the corrective action now, because then you're going to be viewed as a potential impediment based on what the regulations are today. For example, also we have the Complete Streets Master Plan. That's a very great plan. It's very comprehensive. That's not to be argued. However, have we done any of the projects yet? No, because we just adopted it 6 months ago. So there's a lot of infrastructure that has to actually go into place where when we have that, then we can look at that and say, oh yeah, no, we're actually starting to see an increased ridership and things of that nature. So we can create and make those potential improvements or enhancements to our code, inevitably later on down the road. Zoning is not meant to be outdated. It's meant to be flexible, and it's meant to be able to adapt over time as the community changes, as well as obviously technology. I mean, none of us, an e-bike has only been around for a few years.
Yeah.
So, I mean, things like that, I mean, we'll eventually have to probably, what's the next, thing, hoverboards, so we'll have that eventually as well.
Well, on that note, sort of, I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. So if you're building a project, you're gonna need a lot more bike parking if it's sited in an area that is adjacent to really good bike networks, right? If you're on El Camino, it's, there's gonna be a lower demand for bike parking because El Camino is not a safe place to bike. So as this complete street master plan gets built out and we become more bike friendly and it's safer and it's just Los Altos becomes a better place to bike in. What happens to these standards? I mean, what happens when the demand goes up because more people are biking and there's electric bikes and so forth, and it becomes safer and more people want to bike, and we become like Davis, California in that way. How are we going to change these numbers? Because the developers still, the cost of construction and all of that doesn't go away just because you're bike friendly. So is it this nexus you're talking about? Like, okay, you don't have to build as many spots for cars, but you do have to build more spots for bikes. Is that the way it's going to work? I'm just thinking, how does this and the cost to the developer to provide this, how does this get affected by the complete streets master plan and, the implementation of it?
So, I mean, this further helps to do some of the things that inevitably end up getting created through the Complete Streets Master Plan. I mean, this helps to be able to further support that we're trying to become a bicycle oriented and pedestrian friendly type of a jurisdiction. Obviously, the infrastructure itself has to be created for it truly to be able to flourish. One of the additional things, though, and this is not something that the commissions have really purview over, is we did adopt our VMT policy for the city, which is rooted from BTA guidance as well. And there's things associated with that, like a TDM, which is a transportation demand management. And if someone, let's say, had a high BTM threshold and they need to somehow mitigate it, they could have to do some type of subsequent bicycle improvements. But again, that's an additional thing that's separate from this. This is a lot of times, and that's why I define it or kind of reference it, is we try to be corrective in all of our zoning, and that's not what we need to be doing. We need to realize is that there's other components to ultimately entitlements that ends up coming into play, and VMT will actually help to start achieving some of that. And then ultimately, yes, like I referenced, there is also then the overhaul of our parking ratios, which will, I'd be frank with you, any parking study that were to be done is going to tell us you're overparked with every type of use you have. So you need to stop requiring as much, but you can offset that with then creating alternatives of multimodal transit but you can't have both. Because, and I will say, HCD looks at that as, oh, you want to have 3 cars per unit for this type of a unit? Okay, you're crazy, but whatever, what are you going to do to offset it? No, we want both. Oh, it would be viewed as an impediment, and then we would have to go back to the drawing board anyways. So, I mean, there's multiple different components of things that help it, like the VMT policy. And then there's also the, Complete Streets Master Plan, but then there's also the reality check is that we are going to redo our parking ordinance.
Yeah, so can I ask, Nick, is one way to, I agree, Kate, with what you're saying in terms of more is better. It just simply is. But is one way to get there is just economic incentives that developers will have more demand for their buildings over time if they provide these amenities. I mean, you know, we've had people who come, I'm gonna go for the spa on the roof or whatever it is, because I think that's attractive. I think more and more people will say, I want electric bike charging and I want bike spots and I want oversized bikes. It's not perfect, but we're so hamstrung by the requirements. It's kind of my, I mean,
A lot of them are amenity driven, alternatives or additions to especially multi-family housing. I mean, I can tell you the apartment complex that I live in, which is an Irvine company property, that they just got development down. I mean, it's literally, they just do. But I mean, they have like, it's not just like a bike closet. It's not just a bike storage room. I mean, it's a bike hotel really. But that's like one of their things is because we're in a very bikeable part of Santa Clara. So again, it's really going to just be developer driven on some of these amenities as to what do they think their potential clientele of whether or not renters or owners are going to want inevitably for their development.
so in some ways, I think we're better off doing what we're doing in terms of making it a more bike-friendly city, which in turn will drive them to offer these things. It's
I mean, what a
not
nice
that
problem that there would be more demand for bike parking than parking for car. But if we revisit the parking standards and those numbers drop, then can we come right back here and increase these?
I would honestly say that this will also then get looked at with our actual parking ordinance for automobiles to be able to show that, yes, we're going to offset this like a potential increase back to this after we potentially do some type of a decrease for what's allowed. Yeah.
All right. I do have one other comment here. Okay, so just to be clear, short-term parking means not overnight. Is that correct? So that's when we say long-term, it means it's overnight. Okay, so under short-term parking, number 5, it says shall be located in a convenient, highly visible and well-lit area near building entrances on private property. And I was thinking, can we say, you know, well lit by, by a motion sensor? Because I don't like this idea of, I mean, I love the idea of bike parking, but I don't like the idea of creating more exterior lighting that's on all the time at night and then bothering the people who happen to live there or adjacent to the project. So is there a way to just say that, you know, we want it to be well lit, but it should be, you know, well lit as, you know, kind of triggered by a motion sensor?
What I would do is I would say shielded from adjacent properties. That's how we actually usually do that for like lighting performance metrics, is to say that it's shielded or like we say foot candles to be able to further make sure that you're not, you know, the light overflow is not going onto other properties. Because I think to be prescriptive as a motion sensor, you don't know how they would design it necessarily. It could be lower, you know, kind of, 4 foot tall pilasters that have a lit light that's somewhat integrated. You don't really want that turning off and on. It could be a design element. So I think just saying shielded from adjacent properties kind of accomplishes both.
Okay. Well, do we have a lighting standard that we can reference? No.
Well, yeah, I mean, we have some very basic things, but that is something that, yeah, there needs to be further kind of code requirements specific to kind of like the foot candle and things like that, and the ambient light and all those. So there's just basic environmental ones essentially that don't really do what you're trying to accomplish.
Okay, well, I'll take your advice on that one. And I do really like your idea of this strip. Because you're right, it's like, this is cheap. I mean, there is no way a developer can say, I can't afford to do that. And what a benefit to the residents or workers.
Well, or even you could use it to charge your lights.
Oh, I was thinking that too, yeah.
So
You're,
I personally bring a power strip out and plug it into mine. and then hook up all my bike stuff.
Yeah,
You know, if somebody steals the power strip, so be it.
right.
That's just.
Kate, do you have more or
That's it.
any other questions? We're sort of we're sort of running a hybrid meeting here, but any other questions?
I have one more I missed, which was, I was just thinking about the multifamily, the outdoor, the class 2 parking. And the requirement is 1 space per 20 units. So is that like 1 U outside of the building for a 19 unit development? That seems low to me. Like, it seems like we should have a rack of 4 in front of every building, but if you tell me that's crazy, I'll believe you. But like just 1 loop, like you ever been to Spot Pizza? I know you've walked by there. Like there's like 30 bikes like all over the sidewalk. I know that's retail, but retail is even 1 space per.
So
You gonna handle it in another ordinance or some other parking regulations?
So the short term type of like the U situation, one, I'm not actually worried about the cost. It's not very expensive for any developer to have to do that.
Right.
What I'm worried about is us installing too many sidewalk parking facilities essentially, and it being a very high density. I'm actually kind of thinking of the gas station project on ECR. There's 2 different curb cuts. There's also a VTA bus area. There's also VTA ramps. I don't know where you're going to put more than a couple of U-shaped parking facilities on a sidewalk. To also then what, I've been talking about very big in this community is ADA compliance, which is a very big and very expensive thing it's an ongoing losing battle. There's like, it just is. So we have to be cognizant of that. So that's usually one of the reasons why sidewalk park or bicycle parking stalls is usually something cities implement. We've, even done a really good and creative job in Los Altos with doing some of our, what I thought when I first got here were art pieces.
Right.
And I'm like, oh, that's for bicycles. So there is really good and creative ways for us but that's kind of, to me, that's almost like you do it when the project's in place, because you need to see how it's functioning and working, because build out with landscaping, the bus stops, ramps, everything, it ends up being very complex.
But we have a requirement for all the, retail, service businesses, offices, like, and all of them are gonna have 1 out front. Like, it just seems very odd to me.
Yeah. And I agree. It's like, again, it's just one of those things to have somewhat of a built-in matrix or metric for some of the uses based on the different classifications.
So this requirement is for new construction.
Correct.
Okay.
All right, any other questions? Then any public comments?
No.
Okay, then let's close the public hearing. Now we'll officially go into commissioner comments. So anyone want to jump in there?
Well, I will.
Okay.
The first thing I did when I saw this was I started doing some math. Because I think about multifamily, because I'm HOA president, we have 78 homes. This would require space for 78 bicycles, which would be 39 of these lockers. And I calculated that this would come up to something slightly over 1,600 square feet devoted just to the bicycles. And then you would have additional space around for the other things. I have no idea where I would put 1,600 square feet or 2,000 square feet in the building that we have. The entire underground area is parking, is the garage. I say we live in a flower pot because everything is just built on top of that. There are some storage spaces, there's the boiler room, the electrical rooms, there's the tank for the swimming pool, and 160 odd parking spaces. We didn't have any bike spaces because we were built before any of that happened. And we put some in a place where people walk, because it was the only space where we could put them in. And I swear these bicycles breed at night. It's just, and some of them have been sitting there for years untouched. I don't know, people moved and didn't take them with them because they were junkers or whatever. And it's a real problem because every 2 or 3 years, there's some bike thieves that wander through and cull the herd a little bit. And, you know, it's annoying. We have cameras. We actually had caught one thief one year on camera, and the police arrested him, and, you know, so we felt, whatever.
What do the residents do with their bikes? Are they in their units?
Some of them in their units, some of them just have, you know, junky bikes. But that's a bit of a problem, because we're talking about the equivalent of a large unit just for the bicycles, okay? No, but I mean, but this is the problem, and what I see, because the unintended consequences of this are gonna be, as new projects come in, where small infill projects, something the size of what I live in, isn't gonna be built in Los Altos anymore. And so that means that if you're gonna have all these spaces for bikes, and if you're gonna do 1.5 per unit or 1 per bedroom, you're gonna be filling up the ground floor with bicycles, and you're gonna have the garbage, and you're gonna have everything else on the ground floor, which means the buildings are gonna be higher, okay? And in order to afford to do this, the developers are gonna have the density bonus. I'm waiting for there to be a bike parking requirement added to the density bonus law. You know, so the one quarter bike thing per unit, or whatever they do, okay? Because some developer's gonna say, this is too much, I can't afford to do it, okay? Which is how we got the parking ratios we have in the density bonus law. So that concerns me. I'm not saying that we can't do it. I'm just saying, if we're doing this, we're committing ourselves to towers, to hold bicycles, right? And people. And it's maybe smaller units, maybe parking on different floors. But that's places where you can't build units that you can sell. And when you're in the business of selling, if it's all rental, it doesn't matter, right? But these are mostly for sale in Los Altos, and that's a big problem. So I'm saying we're gonna have some consequences of this that we're gonna have to deal with one way or the other, and they're not necessarily gonna be attractive consequences.
And Eric, then are you in support of the 1.5 that was
No.
appropriate?
No.
You would like.
I would not go above 1. I really wouldn't. You know, again, with the electric vehicles, and it's sort of an analogy, we put in some chargers because we got a deal. Nobody uses them. Nobody uses it.
That's very odd.
Well, I mean, they can charge elsewhere, right?
Yeah, they go to the almond school, yeah.
Well, or they get it at work or whatever, and
But the alternative is, people putting bikes on the balconies of the apartments. We've all driven by those.
and we don't allow that, of course, as one doesn't, right? Okay, but yeah, I mean, that is the problem. Or if you have a $3,000 bike, you know, you're going to give it pride of place. I mean, that is a problem. It's not a problem that's easily solved, but what we're doing is we're creating another set of issues that we're going to have to deal with, and that we are going to have to deal with, not our friends from Complete Streets.
Yeah.
You know, and that's going to be a difficult thing to do. And as we go forward, we're going to be having to balance all of that. So I
That
mean,
was my point about the 1 per 1, and just not to interrupt, but
Yeah.
in my experience, I built a 60-story building on a 10,000 square foot lot. We had to have seven parking levels, and we also had to accommodate for bikes. And you are exactly right, is we had to have 1 more floor of underground parking at like $300 a foot to build that. We went down like 60 feet. We always talked about in Los Altos, we may have to go to 5 stories because of things like that. And you know, life is going to change too. We're going to see 5 stories in El Camino come in one of these days, but Eric is absolutely right.
Well, wait a minute.
About the 1 space.
This ordinance does not say that the space has to be together in a single spot, right?
It's just the 30, what is it? I did this.
I know it, I know, but a developer.
Locker's going to be 21 square feet, no matter how many you put together.
I know, but just to be clear, a developer could build, like a storage unit that accommodates a bike, right? Or a bike and, 2 bikes, right?
Circle, that's
And-
what the cell circle did.
And so, there were,
If they have the space.
I mean, part of the problem that you're describing, I think, is wasted real estate. People park a bike because it's not their spot, and they, like you said, they breed overnight, and before you know it, you have all these bikes and nobody removes them because it's not really, it's a common area. But if you had it in a storage area, and it was your storage area, and that real estate is very valuable to you, if you've got an old junky bike in there, you're gonna take it out. So I mean, there's nothing in here that says it couldn't be individual units that are designated, right, for.
Except that you have to build the lockers. you have.
Doesn't have to be a locker. It
Could
can
be a
the-
room.
The room.
Right, but that means you have to have a room large enough, and the space for the bicycles is the same whether it's in a locker or the.
No, they do double deckers, so
But that means you have to be able to get it down, you have an ADA issue with
they
that.
have hooks, they have,
I mean, no, but the point is that this is space that could be used for other stuff. And developers don't like things that they can't use for other things. And it's, I mean, I'm simply saying, and it's exactly right. The other thing we have is you can't always dig in Los Altos. They were 5150 ran into this.
Right, yeah.
Where they couldn't, they said, we can't go down any further. We can't go over here. We can't go over there. Okay. And if you can't go down, you go up. Right? And you can't go out because they're small, narrow infill projects. So they're going to go up. And it's exactly this. I mean, if you could dig down and go down, 6 stories in the ground, it wouldn't be a problem. Although that's a very expensive thing to do. And it's not going to happen here. I mean, so that gets to be a problem, and it's going to put a different kind of pressure on developments and on developers. And we're going to have to deal with that. And the people who come and say, but, right? I mean,
One thing that you mentioned could go somewhere, but that somewhere, square footage is taking away from a saleable unit or rental unit. Whether
Yeah.
1,600 square feet, it's gotta come from somewhere. If they put it on the side yard, but they're already building, within the
there's no
5
side
foot,
yard.
and there's no side yard, and there's no
Yeah.
backyard. That's
Right.
But they've got to build storage anyway, right? They've got to build some storage anyway, and
basement parking.
right, with some storage units.
No, I
right?
don't think every building has storage
Yeah,
units.
not everyone.
But I think it's a major selling point to buy a unit with storage. So
Right.
you have place for your toys, whatever they happen to be, whether you bike or not. And so you could allocate this space in a private storage unit. And if someone doesn't bike, they put something else there. Or if someone needs a spot, they can rent that spot to their neighbor. But it doesn't have to be this big, giant, open area that it's like, it doesn't have to be a free-for-all where, people are leaving junkers. So I think that this doesn't have to be what we're envisioning it to be.
Well, maybe what they do, one idea in San Francisco, you buy a condo and in lots of buildings, if you wanted a parking space, you paid
You have
extra
to pay for it.
and they were very expensive. So you want to buy the condo, you want parking? No. Okay. So now how you develop a building like this is incredible to try and think about. But at least you could have the concept, well, if you don't want a parking place, fine, then your parking area, now we have 250 square feet for a.
But in Los Altos, there's an example, the Vidovich project on San Antonio Road by the Arco station, it's maybe 10 years old now. He has beautiful underground storage areas with but you have to pay for them. So you rent from him and then you have to pay for your storage. And a lot of people, and it's really expensive.
Yeah, and I would say, I think we're getting very prescriptive in this discussion.
I think we're
About
off topic,
issues and
yeah,
things.
yeah.
I think we should focus on what the standards should be and let them figure out what for them makes the most sense in terms of how to implement it. Yeah, I think everyone in an apartment building would love storage in the basement, but it may or may not work out. So
So the question is it
I don't think we should-
1.5?
I think it's
Yeah.
1 or 1.5.
I'd like to make a
I would vote
motion.
against 1.5.
Yeah, I would like to actually make a motion to sort of get this going, because I think we are kind of
But
getting.
before we do that, I want to make one,
Yeah, I didn't want to cut you off,
yeah,
I'm sorry.
let's hear if there's any more comments.
No, I just, I think that the projects that I've seen the last few years, I think it is really hard to fit everything in an underground, garage type setting. So I do actually agree a lot with Eric. I think that it's just going to be very difficult to get to the 1.5. Plus, when you add the fact of adding oversized bike parking, and my concern is that other things will be affected if we do that. So I do think that keeping it at 1, I think is better. But I think that adding more electrical outlets, I think is smart. I think that's an easy thing. But I also think that the well-lit language, I think, again, that's something that is, in my opinion, a little prescriptive. I think that just keeping it as objective as possible, I think is just better. We just want to avoid conflict, with developers, and not have this kind of ambiguity. So, yeah, it'd be great to have 1.5, and it'd be great to have space, have like a hotel for bikes. But I don't, with the size of our lots in Los Altos, I just don't think that we can do that all the time. So that's my concern right now.
And I just wanted to bring up one other thing. We were talking about the schools, and yes, the public schools are exempted, but as Kate pointed out, we do have private schools here. So why don't we make it more than one space per 8 students? I don't think it will come up often, but
Can you regulate private school parking?
public schools can exempt themselves from zoning. I don't know how other people feel, but
We want them to bike.
yeah, we want them to bike, and I understand they may not need it, but I would make that, I don't know what a better standard, maybe for 5 students or 4
High school
students.
was 1 per 4. It was what their goal was.
So I would say something about 1 per 4. Is there any reason we can't do that? No.
But I'd like to comment on the 1.5. I think we need to be forward looking, and I think as we see these newer projects coming in, it's different than the projects that were built 30 years ago. I mean, I guess we can take a vote on 1 or 1.5, and then the city council can do whatever they want when the time comes. But I just think it's a mistake to go with the bare minimum that the VTA recommends is 1 per unit, and the goal is 1 per bedroom. Like, think about that. That's probably more like a 2 per unit number, or 3 or 4.
So
Well, on average, yeah.
from a procedural standpoint, if we're having a discussion about 1 versus 1.5, can we take a straw ballot here, or do we just make it as part of a motion for the whole thing?
You could do a straw.
I think that would make more sense, and then we can come up with a comprehensive motion. So
Just thumbs up.
thumbs up, if you're in favor of the 1.5 as recommended by CSC, raise your hand. Actually. Okay, so it looks like it's gonna be 1.
And I mean, what the city council will get is the motion that the CSC passed and then our motion, right? So they're getting 2 recommendations from the 2 commissions. And then you do with it what.
And so now you have the choice, do you want to not vote for the motion at 1.5?
I move to approve the staff's recommendation, get the wording right, to move forward the bike parking draft ordinance with the amendments using the VTA language. We didn't settle on 6. Did we have any other amendments? We talked about the 6 for 5. We had a typo in there. We didn't have any other amendments, but I also want to make the motion with it being 1, not 1.5.
So let me also then just affirmative. We did talk about shielding the short-term parking. So I have that down.
Yeah.
And then also Commissioner Swinley's grammatical correction.
Incorporating the CSC's, the Complete Streets Committee.
Yeah,
Other than the 1.5.
Yeah, this is more of, in addition to all of the CSCs, with the exception of the 1.5.
Can we
Like to
increase
recommend
schools?
1. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, sure, increase the school.
2.
Only like Pinewood, St. Simon.
Yeah, it's not that many.
So, yeah, it would be 1 to 4 for short term, which then following the same, it would be 1 to 5 then for long term.
I don't think you need it for long term.
Okay.
Very few teachers bike to
Okay.
school, sadly, because they
That
can't
works.
live here.
And so all of the CSC's recommendations, 75 inches.
Everything else. Yep.
And then, the oversized parking that the CSC mentioned, is that something that, because I know, I forget what her name was, but she was saying for 1 oversized, but I mean, how do we figure out if it's gonna be 1 space? I mean, that's gonna be it.
That was a weird one.
And also oversized bikes, there's probably so many that are different sizes, so like, how do we objectively add that?
Well, if you had 1.5, you could park. One regular bike.
Good dog, Joe.
It's their recommendation. We don't have to put that in ours, correct?
Well, you're accepting essentially all of their recommendations with the exception of the 1, and then you're including 2 additional. as a part of it to further clarify the ordinance. So you could then have that as one deviation in addition to the 1.5 ratio.
I think you.
I just think it gets way too confusing, to ask a developer to include one oversized bike. I mean, it's gonna, I think, cause a lot of confusion, and also that spot is gonna be probably fought over like crazy. So I just, yeah. So I don't know.
Even define it.
Yeah,
Like, what
that's
is
the problem.
oversized spot and where does it go?
Where does it go?
Who's allowed to use it? And
Yeah.
So is the commission in favor of having some of them be oversized parking or not having any oversized?
To me, it falls under it would be great if they can do it, but I agree, it can be confusing.
Yeah, too confused.
Okay, I have a question. What did they pass? What did the CS? I mean, I thought the motion that they passed said some percentage,
one oversized parking, I believe.
one per development,
It
one
was
oversized.
ambiguous.
spot?
They didn't specify.
Yeah, they didn't specify, so, I don't know, maybe we should have one, but again, how big is that?
I think we should let staff make a recommendation to city council on oversized.
Slight issue, somebody could do an analysis over the bike storage, but how many tandem bikes do you sell? How many in the community? It couldn't be too difficult.
It's those, no, the ones that have the child seat on the back, yeah, so.
Really, it's like if you've been to Holland, how they have baskets in front that they carry their kids.
Some of the electric bikes are really wide. They're more like motorcycles than bicycles.
So what is our motion?
One, yeah.
You can restate it. I think we have
They
it.
had it.
They had it.
But do we have a second on that?
On the motion,
Yeah.
second the motion.
So I don't want to hijack the meeting, but do we want to come back to the outlets, the strip of outlets? Because that to me, what you said, it's like, okay, $50 guys, and now we can
But I
accommodate.
thought you were gonna do that in the reach codes, so that's fine.
Yeah,
That was a recommendation.
I think that realistically to kind of like really further refine that is something that we can do in the reach codes, because there is a kind of we talk about it for automobile electrification, we can talk about it for something like that, is that it's an electrification of the building.
The only, I don't know, how I would disagree with that is it's specified that we have one, like, so we're specifying something, it's just a very minimal, like one rounds to zero pretty much, so. I don't know.
So this standard would eventually go away in the zoning code, and it would be prescriptive in the building code, where really it should live. Because again, your developers are gonna be more, they're gonna be more interested in asking for a waiver of some sort from a zoning requirement rather than building code requirement.
And how do we make sure it gets incorporated in the reach codes?
I'm the one writing them right now, so noted.
There's also a financial and technical issue. That's when you're writing them, you have to be really cognizant of that.
Right, yeah, and that's partly why I actually want it to probably be in, if I had it my way, to recommend it to be in the reach codes, is because then it kind of lives in the electrification kind of realm, where if there ends up being some type of a hindrance, 330 Distal is a good example of this. It's a different situation for them because they're going to be able to obtain grant funding,
Right.
because they're an affordable project. But some of them are going to, depending on how much you keep on trying to electrify a building, we're talking about bigger, bigger amps, bigger panels, transformers even. So there ends up being a lot of complexities to it from a electrical engineering standpoint.
And no waiver of reach codes.
They technically can, but it's only very savvy developers that kind of know that, and then it still has to go to the underlying base of what is required, and is not the reach. So what is our base, not the reach?
And we could put this strip in our base, could we?
Or maybe we should take this out, like any electrification language in here, maybe it doesn't belong here.
But we're also getting in, strip, yes, makes perfect sense if all your bicycle parking is next to each other. But to the extent someone does something where they have a bicycle parking in every parking spot, it doesn't make sense.
Well, no, but what I suggested was one outlet per bicycle parking spot. And
Okay, so
in
not-
a bike room like the Stell Circle, they're in a row,
Right.
but this just seems like a misnomer almost, like there's language about electrification and actually it goes up above one if there's more than 20 units. So it feels like.
You want every bicycle spot to have a
Well,
charging.
that was my suggestion, but Nick said maybe we shouldn't include that here, maybe we should do it elsewhere, but we have some language about electrification here. I'm almost suggesting we remove that and handle it elsewhere, but I defer to Mr.
So
Jones.
I think because the CSD, just in practicality, I think the council will probably want to leave it because it's ultimately at least in place for now until it for sure solidifies. Again, zoning is going to become iterative a little bit in the next couple of years because we're gonna have to refine and define what we have and what we're going to want. And so things are gonna have to adapt a little bit. So I think we can continue to tweak.
So we have the motion. The main change is it's one per spot, one per unit, not 1.5. We've incorporated the other comments for the most part from the complete streets, and we've changed the school to one spot per four students. There has not yet been a second.
Eric second.
Oh, you second, I'm sorry,
I did
Eric
second,
second,
yeah.
okay, I stand corrected. So
I
I
still second it.
Okay. I think we're ready for a vote, so Stephanie, if you could call.
Why do I always go first? No, that's okay. Aye.
Commissioner Vanato,
Yes.
Commissioner Durant. Yes. Commissioner Roach.
Yes.
Yes.
Vice Chair Ahi.
Yes.
Yes. And for the record, it's Doran, just Doran, not Dorian, just so you know.
Okay, let's move on. Any commissioner reports or comments?
I was at the monitor, the February 28th city council meeting. They discussed the I think it was level 6 building. And they introduced and waived further reading of the ordinance. So no changes on the next week.
All right, great. Potential future agenda items, I will defer to our planning staff.
There will be some upcoming additional zone text amendments for additional implementing ordinances from the housing for the housing elements. They're going to be somewhat related to supportive transitional types of housing. Those, I'll at least preface, are going to be pretty standard, that it's going to be things that are from the government code section. There's not much that we locally should try to amend with those, but obviously you'll see those and we can kind of go from there when they are in front of you. Those again are kind of like lower hanging fruit. Unfortunately, those were something that was supposed to be done like 8 years ago and they never were touched. So we will be doing those and we are doing them before the end of the year, but we will be doing them probably in the next 30 to 60 days. Other than that, we kind of have a little bit of, I would say, kind of calm before the storm when it comes to development applications. I think that's very indicative of just coming out of the building code cycle change. So we'll still have some developers that are catching up and closing out projects that they're already in. And then we should start seeing some more, probably, I would say, around summertime again. And, you know, kind of go from there.
Okay,
You
great.
have a meeting on the 20th of April? Oh, maybe we don't.
No, we don't have anything on the agenda as of right this second.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
So we don't have anything. So can we take it off our calendar? That's,
I think there could still be something.
I think there still could be something as up till next week, but then it would be able to fall off after next Thursday,
Okay, but-
essentially.
nothing on for the 6th.
Right? Do we have anything next week for our regular scheduled meeting?
No,
No.
this was it. In theory, if we had continued last week, we
Right.
would have gone, yeah.
All right,
So no meeting at the beginning of April, possibly later in April.
thank you all. It's been a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you, Michelle.
Next time we'll get
Solid
together.
today, yeah.
And let's call the meeting adjourned.
Okay.
And thank you all for coming in person. I know it was a bit of a shock to our system.
We're gonna dress up again. That's all in the past.
Yeah.